How can you walk 12,500 kilometers through hell when your lungs are falling apart? How can you survive that to become one of the most powerful women in the world? And how can you do all that in silence? Western history remembers Zhou Enlai, the charming man, but history has forgotten the woman who stood in his shadow, Deng Yingchao. So, what was their marriage? A love? Or was it a contract signed in blood and secret between two of the most ruthless revolutionaries? And the real ghost of the Chinese Revolution was not Mao, but the woman who survived them all? To be such a ruthless and silent survivor, you have to be born into a world that leaves you no other choice. China in 1904, where she was born, was not an ancient and proud empire. It was humiliation itself, forced to watch its own decay as it was torn apart alive. The Qing dynasty, the last imperial line, which had ruled for over 250 years, was rotting from the inside out. For nearly a century, it had been systemically humiliated by foreign powers. The Opium Wars with Great Britain had forcibly opened the country to foreign trade and narcotics, ceding Hong Kong. The Boxer Rebellion, a violent mystical uprising against foreigners, had been brutally crushed in 1901 by an 8-nation alliance, including Britain, France, America, Germany, and Japan, which then occupied Beijing and exacted crippling nation-breaking reparations. This was a nation on its knees. Foreign powers operated with impunity, carving out concessions in major cities like Shanghai and Tianjin. These were entire neighborhoods where Chinese law did not apply, where Western soldiers and businessmen lived in luxury, and parks notoriously had insulting rules, such as regulations that barred dogs, and separate ones that barred most Chinese. Internally, the social structure was just as broken. It was a feudal society, stagnant and suffocating, governed by a rigid Confucian code that had been law for 2 millennia. This code demanded absolute obedience of the citizen to the emperor, of the child to the father, and most of all, of the woman to the man. For millions of women, this meant a life of servitude. Their existence was defined by the 3 obediences: to their father before marriage, to their husband after marriage, and to their eldest son after their husband's death. Their most intimate symbol of this oppression was a physical one: the horrific, systematic practice of foot binding. From early childhood, a girl's feet would be broken and bound tightly, bending the toes under the sole and crushing the arch. The goal was to create a tiny 3-inch golden lotus, a deformed, doll-like foot that rendered the woman immobile, crippled for life, and thus desirable and utterly dependent. This was the collapsing world Deng Yingchao was born into. The humiliation was total, foreign, political, and personal. The breaking point finally came. In 1911, a revolution swept the nation, and the last emperor, a child, abdicated. The Qing dynasty was no more, but what replaced it wasn't peace, it was chaos. The country fractured. Warlords, regional military strongmen, tore China apart, fighting each other for territory and plunder, funded by different foreign powers. And the humiliation from the West continued. In 1919, the First World War ended. China, having declared war on Germany, was technically one of the victors. Its young intellectuals believed this was their chance. They believed the great Western powers, particularly the United States with its President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points on self-determination, would finally right the wrongs done to China. They were catastrophically wrong. At the Treaty of Versailles, the Allied powers, including Britain, France, and the U.S., simply ignored China's pleas. They took the German-controlled territories in China's Shandong province and handed them directly to the Japanese. The news shattered China's last remaining illusions about the West. The nation's youth erupted. This was the birth of the May 4th movement. It wasn't merely a firestorm, it was a tectonic shift, cracking the foundations of a 2,000-year-old world. On May 4th, 1919, students from 13 universities flooded the streets of Beijing, screaming "Down with imperialism" and "Return Shandong." But they were also screaming for something more. They were screaming for a total violent destruction of the old, failed Confucian world that had allowed this to happen. They demanded Deng Yingchao and Cai Jiansheng, Mr. Democracy and Mr. Science. They demanded a new culture, a new language, and crucially, the total liberation of women. This was the crucible that would shape the 20th century. This was the moment that Marxism-Leninism found its fertile ground in China's soil. And it was the exact moment a poor, fatherless schoolgirl in the city of Tianjin found her voice. She wasn't born Deng Yingchao. She was born Deng Wenshu on February 4th, 1904, in Nanning, the provincial capital of Guangxi. Her name, Wenshu, meant gentle and refined, a classical feminine name that would become a profound irony. Her family had ancestral roots in Guangshan, in the central Henan province, the cradle of Chinese civilization. But they were far from that center of power. Her father, Deng Yingchao, was a shukai, a man who had passed the entry-level imperial examinations. This made him a member of the gentry, but in a collapsing system, his degree offered little more than a respectable title. He was educated for a world that no longer existed. When Deng Wenshu was just a year or two old, around 1905 or 1906, her father died. The exact cause is lost to history, but the consequence was immediate and catastrophic. In the feudal China of the early 1900s, a widow with a young daughter was at the absolute bottom of the social ladder. They had no status, no protection, and no income. The respectable, if modest life they had known evaporated overnight. They were plunged into abject poverty. This was Deng Wenshu's first reality, not the grand sweep of history, but the cold, daily, grinding humiliation of poverty. This was her decline, her early decline, the early tragedy that would define her. But this story could have ended there, with another widow and daughter lost to history, if not for one extraordinary fact: her mother. Deng's mother, Yang Zhende, was not a typical woman. She was not defined by the three obediences. Yang Zhende was educated. More than that, she was a nuyishi, a female physician. It is difficult to overstate how rare this was. In a society that barely permitted women to be literate, this profession gave her agency and was the single asset that stood between her family and utter destitution. Yang Zhende refused to follow the traditional path for a widow. She didn't commit suicide to show loyalty. She didn't remarry into another family, and she didn't sink into beggary. She packed up what little they had and began a nomadic, desperate existence, moving from place to place, supporting herself and her daughter by teaching in private homes and practicing medicine. This was Deng Wenshu's childhood. It was not a time of play or comfort. It was a time of watching her mother fight against an entire social order just to survive. She saw firsthand the crushing weight of a society that despised women, especially poor women. And she saw in her mother the only inspiration she would ever need, a single, unbending figure of resilience and self-reliance. This upbringing forged in her a single law of survival: trust no one. Rely only on yourself. This wasn't a core of steel, it was psychological armor, preemptively shutting down any expectation of help from others. But, as noted in the analysis of her life, it also likely created a profound emotional isolation. It was her and her mother against the entire world. Trust was a luxury, Affection was secondary to survival. This was the psychological bedrock upon which her entire revolutionary career would be built. Yang Zhenda knew, with the certainty of a survivor, that there was only one possible path out of this trap for her daughter, the same one she had used: education. It was the only armor, the only weapon. She scraped together every coin she could, driven by the singular goal of getting her daughter into a real school. Finally, in 1913, when Deng was 9 years old, her mother succeeded. She secured a place for her daughter at the Beiyang Women's Normal School in the city of Tianjin. The move to Tianjin was like moving to another planet. Nanning had been a remote provincial city. Tianjin was one of the most volatile, modern, and humiliated cities in all of China. After the Boxer Rebellion, it had been carved up into 8 separate foreign concessions: British, French, American, German, Japanese, and others. It was a hyper-colonized port city, a place where Chinese sovereignty was a joke. You could walk down a street and pass from the British concession, with its red pillar boxes, to the German concession, with its Bavarian architecture. This city was a daily visceral reminder of China's weakness. And it was a hotbed of new radical ideas. The Beiyang Women's Normal School was, on the surface, a respectable institution. A normal school was a teacher's college. In a time when universities were almost exclusively male, this was one of the only avenues for a woman to receive a higher education. The goal was to train a new generation of female teachers to, in turn, educate other girls. For Deng Yingchao, the poor fatherless girl from Guangxi, just walking through these gates was a peak. It was a miracle. It was the rarest of opportunities. But the school was more than just a path to a respectable job. It was an incubator for radical thought. Here, Deng did not just study the Chinese classics. She was exposed for the very first time to modern thought. She studied science, mathematics, geography, and physical education. And most importantly, she read. This was her first crucial Western contact, her contact with the West. Not the West of gunboats and racist park signs, but the West of ideas. She and her classmates devoured translations of European writers. They read Henrik Ibsen's play A Doll's House and its story of Nora, a woman who slams the door on her husband and her old life, became a clarion call for an entire generation of Chinese women. They read about the suffragettes in Britain, about the fight for women's rights in France. They read about democracy, about anarchism, about socialism. This was European feminism, delivered through books, and it landed like a bomb in the mind of a girl who had seen firsthand what the lack of these rights meant. Her personal, familial struggle against poverty and sexism now had a name, an ideology, and a global context. She was an exceptional student, but she was also quiet, serious, and intensely focused. Her poverty set her apart. She couldn't afford the nice clothes or simple luxuries of her classmates. This only deepened her resolve. She was not there to socialize. She was there to acquire the intellectual tools needed for the coming fight. For 6 years, from 1913 to 1919, she absorbed it all. The daily humiliation of living in concession-riddled Tianjin, the intellectual explosion of new radical Western ideas, and the burning memory of her mother's struggle. She was no longer Deng Yingchao, gentle and refined. She was a 15-year-old revolutionary in waiting. All she needed was a spark. On May 4th, 1919, the spark ignited. The news from Versailles, the betrayal by the Western powers, the handing of Shandong to Japan, was the ultimate final humiliation. The student protests that exploded in Beijing spread instantly to Tianjin. This was the moment Deng's entire life had been building toward. The abstract forces that had crushed her family were no longer abstract. The Western imperialism that her analysis points to was not just a political theory. It was the British, French, and American leaders at Versailles who had betrayed China. It was the foreign soldiers who patrolled her city. The feudal society that had crippled her country was the same system that had left her and her mother destitute, the same system that had bound the feet of the women around her. Her family poverty was not a personal failure. It was the direct result of this rotten, corrupt, and weak system. As the analysis correctly states, this poverty was the motivation for her to join the revolution. Her desire for education had transformed into a desire for total societal upheaval. The 15-year-old Deng Yingchao did not just join the protests, she became a leader. She helped found one of the first patriotic women's organizations in the city, the Tianjin Women's Patriotic Comrade Association. She was on the streets organizing, giving speeches, her voice ringing out. She and her fellow female students marched shoulder to shoulder with the men, a revolutionary act in itself. They boycotted Japanese goods. They stormed the offices of pro-Japanese officials. This was a gekokujo, a Japanese term for overthrowing social norms, or the low overthrowing the high. This was a generation of women, the lowest of the low, in the old Confucian order, rising up to seize control of their nation's destiny. Deng was at the absolute forefront. She was helping to spread awareness of gender equality in the most direct way possible, by doing, by leading. This was her contribution to the May 4th movement. She wasn't just a follower. She was an organizer, a representative of this new generation of awakened women. And it was in this upheaval on the chaotic, shouting streets of Tianjin that she would first meet a group of other young, radical students. Among them was a charismatic, intense young man 5 years her senior. His name was Zhou Enlai. Their paths had crossed, but her own journey, the one that would truly make her Deng Yingchao, was just beginning. The May 4th movement was a firestorm. But firestorms don't last. They either burn themselves out or they concentrate into something hotter, more focused, and more dangerous. For Deng Yingchao, the public roar of the protest wasn't the end. It was the audition. She had proven her commitment not with words but with action, facing down police and the risk of arrest. Now it was time to move. It was time to go from the streets into the shadows, to join the intellectual and spiritual core of the revolution. It was time for her and a select few others to truly awaken. In September 1919, just a few months after the May 4th eruption, a small group of students met in secret in Tianjin. There were fewer than 24 of them. They were the most committed, the most intellectually hungry of the city's activists. Among them were the 15-year-old Deng Yingchao and the 21-year-old Zhou Enlai. They founded a secret society. They called it the Zhui, the Awakening Society. This was not a social club. It was a tightly knit group dedicated to revolutionary theory and action. And it was, for its time, profoundly radical. First, it was co-ed. It included both young men and young women as total equals. This was almost unheard of. In a society that still segregated the sexes in almost every aspect of public life, this was a direct physical assault on the old Confucian order. Deng Yingchao, still known then as Deng Yingchao, was one of the youngest members, but she was already one of its most forceful. Their manifesto, as noted in the historical analysis, was a declaration of war on everything. They pledged to analyze, critique, and ultimately abolish the entirety of the old world. Their targets? Militarism, bourgeoisie, gender inequality, and old morality. This was far beyond just get Japan out of Shandong. This was a call for total social, political, and cultural annihilation. They adopted a strict, almost monastic lifestyle. They lived and worked together. They held intense study sessions, debating the new ideas flooding into China: anarchism, guild socialism, and the explosive, compelling theories of two German writers, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. This was where Deng Yingchao first encountered, in a deep and systematic way, the tenets of Marxism-Leninism. It provided a scientific, structured answer to the chaos she had lived through. It explained her poverty, it explained her mother's struggle, and it offered a clear, if violent, path forward. The members of the Awakening Society adopted number names to protect their identities. Deng was number 1, Zhou Enlai was number 5. This wasn't a sign of rank, but it was symbolic. From the very beginning, Deng was at the center of the organization. Deng's personal mission within the group was clear: the liberation of women. This was not an abstract political goal for her. It was the core of her entire being, forged in her own fatherless, impoverished childhood. She didn't just debate it. She took it to the streets. She organized and led speech groups specifically for women. She would stand on street corners, on wooden crates, and speak to crowds of women, students, workers, and sometimes even the illiterate, bound-foot wives of merchants, about their own oppression. She passionately advocated for the abolition of foot binding. This may seem like an obvious, archaic issue to us now, but in 1919 it was still a deeply embedded cultural practice. To attack it was to attack the very heart of traditional family values and concepts of beauty. Deng argued that a woman with bound feet was a slave, a cripple, a symbol of a crippled nation. A new China, she argued, could only be built by women who could stand and walk and run. She and her female comrades also engaged in direct action. They led boycotts of Japanese goods, standing outside shops, shaming customers, and sometimes seizing and burning Japanese-made products. This was dangerous, confrontational work, and it was about to get much more dangerous. The Awakening Society published its own magazine, Awakening. In January 1920, the Tianjin authorities, terrified of this new wave of radicalism, shut it down and arrested one of its student editors. The society decided to respond with force. On January 29, 1920, Zhou Enlai led a delegation of students, including Deng Yingchao and other members of the Awakening Society, to the provincial government headquarters to demand the editor's release. It was a trap. The authorities were waiting. The protest turned violent. The police moved in, and in the ensuing chaos, 4 of the movement's key leaders were arrested. Zhou Enlai was one of them. The next day, Deng Yingchao, now 16 years old, stepped up. She took command of the remaining student forces and organized a massive citywide protest to demand the release of Zhou and the others. She led the march, her voice ringing out, her small frame at the very front of the crowd. The authorities met them with overwhelming force. The protest was broken, and Deng Yingchao, along with 24 other student leaders, was arrested. This was a critical turning point. For 6 months, Deng Yingchao and Zhou Enlai were imprisoned together. This wasn't a modern jail. It was a cold, dark, traditional Chinese prison. But for these revolutionaries, it became a university. This was the crucible where the revolutionary friendship between Deng and Zhou was truly forged. They weren't just comrades, they were co-conspirators and fellow prisoners. They organized their fellow inmates. They held clandestine study groups, passing around banned Marxist texts. They debated political strategy late into the night. They analyzed the failures of the May 4th movement and planned their next moves. This 6-month period of shared hardship, intense intellectual exchange, and mutual reliance created a bond far deeper than any romance. It was a bond of Jianyu, comrades in arms. They had proven to each other that they were willing to sacrifice their freedom and potentially their lives for the cause. When they were finally released in July 1920, due to immense public pressure, they were no longer just student activists. They were hardened, professional revolutionaries. But their paths were about to diverge dramatically. The revolutionary world was now splitting. Some, like Mao Zedong and Hunan, believed the revolution's future lay in organizing the peasant masses within China. Others believed they had to go to the source. They had to go to the West. In November 1920, Zhou Enlai, along with many of the other male members of the Awakening Society, boarded a ship for France. He was part of the Diligent Work Frugal Study movement, a program that sent thousands of young Chinese students to Europe. The idea was to work in factories, at Renault, at coal mines, and study Western science, technology, and most importantly, political theory. This was Zhou's Western contact, and it would be definitive. He was in the heart of post-war Europe, a continent seething with new ideas. He traveled between Paris, Berlin, and London, witnessing firsthand the strikes, the workers' movements, and the debates raging between socialists, anarchists, and the new disciplined communists loyal to Lenin's Soviet Union. He became a full-time organizer, creating the European branch of the Chinese Communist Party. And what about Deng Yingchao? She stayed behind. This is one of the most critical and often overlooked periods of her life. While Zhou was in Paris, she was in a much tougher, more dangerous, and less glamorous front, China itself. The revolutionary movement was at a low ebb. The Awakening Society had effectively dissolved with the departure of its key members. Deng Yingchao was on her own. She was 17 years old. She had to support herself and her mother. She did the only thing she knew how. She became a teacher. She got a job at the Beihang Women's Normal School's attached primary school. But this was not a quiet retreat from politics. It was a continuation of the revolution by other means. She was teaching the poorest children in Tianjin, the sons and daughters of rickshaw pullers and dock workers. She wasn't just teaching them to read and write. She was planting the seeds of revolution, introducing the same radical ideas she had learned to the next generation. She continued her political work in secret. She organized women workers. She built a new network. She was a lone agent, keeping the faith in a time of deep repression. This 5-year period from 1920 to 1925 reveals the core of her character. Zhou was the internationalist, the intellectual, the networker. Deng was the grassroots organizer, the teacher, the one who stayed on the front lines, risking arrest every single day while trying to earn a living. She formally joined the Socialist Youth League in 1924, and the next year, in 1925, she officially joined the Chinese Communist Party. Her years of dedicated, lonely work had been recognized. She wasn't just a recruit. She was immediately made a leader. She was appointed head of the women's department for the CCP's Tianjin-Beijing Regional Committee. She had built her own career, her own revolutionary credentials, entirely separate from the now famous Zhou Enlai in Europe. For 5 years, she and Zhou had corresponded. But these were not love letters. They were, as you might expect, political letters. They debated the future of the revolution. They discussed the merits of the KMT, which the Soviets were now forcing the young CCP to ally with. They were letters between two high-level comrades, sharing field reports from different fronts. Then, in the spring of 1925, a postcard arrived from Europe. It was from Zhou Enlai. It was not a passionate declaration of love. It was a proposal of marriage. According to her own memoirs, Deng was shocked. She hesitated. This, as the analysis points out, was the tragedy or conflict of her May 4th ideals. She had passionately believed, and perhaps still did, that marriage ends a woman's life. She had seen it happen. Marriage meant children, domesticity, and submission to a husband. It meant the end of her freedom, the end of her revolutionary work. She wrote back to him, expressing these exact fears. Zhou's reply was a masterpiece of political persuasion. He assured her that he wasn't looking for a wife in the traditional sense. He was looking for a companion, a comrade in arms who would fight alongside him, not a woman who would wash his clothes and wait for him at home. He told her he was an opponent of marriage as an institution, but that he needed a partner he could trust, an equal who shared his ideals. He convinced her that their marriage would not be an end, but a political alliance, a revolutionary partnership. She accepted. In the summer of 1925, she left her work in Tianjin and traveled south to the revolutionary hotspot of Guangzhou, where Zhou Enlai, having just returned from Europe, was now a rising star in the new KMT-CCP alliance. On August 8, 1925, they were married. There was no white dress, no grand banquet, no family celebration. It was a simple revolutionary ceremony attended by a few comrades. She was 21, he was 26. Their 51-year alliance had begun. This is where we must address the core of their union. To the world, and in all official CCP history, they were the perfect revolutionary couple. However, historians have long debated the personal nature of their marriage. Unlike traditional marriages, theirs was forged in prison and defined by political letters. It was, first and foremost, a revolutionary partnership between two equals who trusted each other implicitly. Most mainstream historians, like Gao Wenqian, argue that Zhou Enlai was a man who had completely repressed all personal desires, perhaps even being asexual, in service of the revolution. In this view, his bond with Deng was one of deep comradely affection, but devoid of conventional romance. A recent highly controversial book, Tsoi Wing Mui's 2015 The Secret Emotional Life of Zhou Enlai, has posited that Zhou was in love with a male classmate, making the marriage a political cover. This theory, however, remains a fringe view not accepted by mainstream historians, who find the evidence ambiguous. What is certain is that their partnership was built on shared ideology rather than passion. This, combined with the brutal realities of their lives, led to their childlessness. Deng Yingchao, the May 4th feminist who feared marriage would end her life, had instead entered a union that bound her forever to the center of the revolution, eventually transforming her public identity into Mrs. Zhou Enlai. The ink on their revolutionary marriage certificate was barely dry when the ground began to shake. The alliance Deng Yingchao had entered into was not just with her new husband, but with the First United Front, that fragile, suspicious pact between her communists and the far more powerful Nationalist Party, the KMT. They were living in a revolutionary hotspot, but it was also a powder keg. And just as Deng began to navigate this new life facing her first pregnancy, the KMT's leader, Chiang Kai-shek, was preparing to light the fuse. Her new life and her new alliance were about to face the ultimate test of survival amid civil war. The marriage of Deng Yingchao and Zhou Enlai, sealed in August 1925, was not the start of a quiet domestic life. It was a final oath of loyalty before their entire world exploded. They were in Guangzhou, the center of the revolution. Zhou Enlai, with his European prestige and organizational genius, was a rising star at the Whampoa Military Academy. Deng Yingchao, a proven organizer, plunged into work, rallying female workers and students. But beneath the surface, the alliance was rotting. Chiang Kai-shek, a military nationalist, despised the communists he was forced to work with. The communists, in turn, saw the nationalists as a temporary tool. It was a tinderbox, and Deng Yingchao was standing right on top of it. It was in this suffocating atmosphere that her first devastating personal tragedy struck. Just months after her wedding, in late 1925, Deng Yingchao became pregnant. But there was no time for rest. She worked relentlessly, organizing, giving speeches, ignoring the exhaustion. As a result, she suffered a miscarriage. The next year, 1926, she was pregnant again. This time, she was more careful. But as she went into labor, Zhou Enlai was away, sent on a mission by the party. She endured the childbirth alone. The baby was in a breech position. The labor was agonizing and prolonged. When the child, a boy, was finally born, he had suffocated to death. Alone in a room in Guangzhou, Deng Yingchao had lost her second child. In 1927, she was pregnant for a third time. But before she could hope or fear, politics intervened with brutal finality. On April 12, 1927, Chiang Kai-shek made his move. In Shanghai, the industrial heart and a communist stronghold, he unleashed a brutal purge. Thousands of communists, trade union leaders, students, and intellectuals were hunted through the streets by KMT forces and the criminal gangs Chiang had secretly allied with. They were dragged from their homes, shot on sight, beheaded. Union headquarters were raided and burned. Blood flowed in the gutters of Shanghai. This was the White Terror, the Shanghai Massacre. The United Front was shattered. The Chinese Civil War had begun. In an instant, the CCP went from government partners to hunted animals. Deng Yingchao and Zhou Enlai were two of the top names on Chiang's wanted list. They barely escaped. Zhou, who was in Shanghai organizing a workers' uprising, fled by the skin of his teeth, hidden by loyal comrades. Deng in Guangzhou was also forced to run as the purge spread. And in the chaos, the extreme stress, and the desperate flight for her life, she lost her third child. It's believed to have been an ectopic pregnancy, a life-threatening condition which ruptured under the strain. In the span of a few months, she had lost her ideals, her party was shattered, and the last child she would ever conceive was gone. The doctors told her that due to the complications, she would be barren for the rest of her life. This was her life's tragedy. Her life's tragedy, carved not just by politics, but by a brutal biological finality. At 23, her future as a mother was over, sacrificed to the political violence of a revolution that had just devoured its own. From 1927 to 1932, Deng Yingchao and Zhou Enlai lived underground, constantly moving, their existence erased from public view. They became the heart of the CCP's underground work, based in the most dangerous and paradoxically the safest place to be, Shanghai. It was a city of divisions. It had international settlements, vast areas controlled by the British, French, and Americans. Chiang Kai-shek's KMT police could not operate freely here, so the concessions became the unwilling hiding place for the revolution's most wanted. Deng Yingchao's life was transformed. She was no longer a public speaker, a mass organizer. She was a secret agent. She lived in a series of anonymous safe houses, moving constantly, never staying in one place for more than a few weeks. She used aliases, wore disguises, sometimes the wife of a wealthy businessman, sometimes a factory worker. She and Zhou Enlai rarely lived together. It was too dangerous. They met for fleeting moments on secret street corners, in parks, exchanging coded information before melting back into the crowds. The psychological pressure was immense. Every knock on the door could be the secret police. Every friendly neighbor could be an informant. Every captured comrade could, under torture, reveal the entire network. Deng's role here was critical. She was not just Mrs. Zhou. She was a core operative. She handled secret communications, managed the party's meager funds smuggled in from the Soviet Union, and tried to rebuild the women's organizations that had been completely wiped out in the White Terror. She lived under unimaginable pressure, and her health, already fragile, began to break. The tuberculosis she had contracted in her youth, always lurking in her lungs, began to show signs of returning. By 1932, the noose was too tight. A series of high-level arrests and betrayals had shattered the Shanghai network. To stay meant certain death. The party leadership, including Deng Yingchao, made a desperate decision: abandon the cities and retreat to the only rural stronghold they still held, a remote mountainous region in Jiangxi province, known as the Jiangxi Soviet. The move to Jiangxi was like traveling back in time. They had left modern, cosmopolitan Shanghai for one of the poorest, most isolated regions of China. This was where Mao Zedong had built his power base. Instead of urban factory workers, his army was made of peasants. It was a different world, with a different brand of revolution. For Deng Yingchao, the job changed again. She was no longer a secret agent. She was an official in a budding communist state. She immediately set to work organizing the peasant women. This was a new challenge. These women were not the radical students of Tianjin. Many were illiterate, had bound feet, and had lived under feudal domination for generations. Deng pioneered literacy campaigns. She helped enforce the new Soviet marriage law, a radical document that granted women the freedom to divorce and forbade arranged marriages. She organized women into production, sewing uniforms and making shoes for the Red Army, which was constantly fighting off Chiang Kai-shek's encircling KMT troops. But even within this stronghold, she was not safe. CCP factions were rampant. The Soviet-backed leaders, fresh from Shanghai, clashed with Mao Zedong, who believed in a peasant-based revolution. Deng and Zhou, with their international experience and adherence to the Soviet line, were initially objects of suspicion. They had to navigate an internal political minefield as dangerous as the enemy outside. And the enemy outside was closing in. Chiang Kai-shek was determined to crush this communist tumor. He launched a series of massive encirclement campaigns. The first, second, and third, Mao's Red Army had defeated them all with guerrilla tactics. But for the fifth campaign in 1933, Chiang, advised by Nazi German strategists, adopted a slow, crushing plan. His armies didn't attack. They built. Thousands of concrete blockhouses linked by barbed wire and roads slowly tightened a noose around the Soviet. By 1934, the Jiangxi Soviet was suffocating. They were out of salt, out of medicine, and running out of ammunition. It was a death trap. In October 1934, the CCP leadership made the only decision it could to break out and flee. They assembled some 86,000 Red Army soldiers, along with party officials and a few thousand civilians, to try to punch through the encirclement and march to a new safe base. They had no idea where they were going. They only knew they had to go. The fabled long march had begun. This was not a march. It was a catastrophic, year-long retreat, and it almost killed Deng Yingchao. Of the tens of thousands who began the trek, only about 30 women were allowed to go. They were either the wives of high-level leaders or irreplaceable party veterans. Deng Yingchao at 30 was one of them. Her inclusion was a sign of her status, but she was critically ill. Her relapse of tuberculosis had returned with a vengeance. She had a raging fever, was coughing up blood, and was too weak to walk. From the very first days, she had to be carried on a stretcher, 2 bamboo poles with a piece of canvas strung between them. For a proud revolutionary who had spent her life fighting and working, this was the ultimate psychological humiliation. She felt herself a burden, consuming the precious energy of the soldiers who had to carry her. The journey was a 12,500-kilometer nightmare. First came the crossing of the Yang River. The KMT was waiting for them. It was a massacre. The Red Army lost more than half its forces in a single week-long battle. Deng Yingchao, on her stretcher, could only listen to the machine guns and screams as they were bombed by planes, helplessly watching her comrades be torn apart. Then came the mountains. They had to cross the snow-capped peaks of the great snowy mountains. They had no winter clothing, only thin cotton uniforms and straw sandals. Deng, shivering with fever, nearly froze to death. She watched young soldiers sit down to rest on the trail, only to never get up again, frozen, solid. Worst of all were the grasslands, a vast, high-altitude, unmapped marsh. It was a waterlogged swamp with no food, no firewood. The water was stagnant, full of disease and undrinkable. They got lost and they starved. They ate whatever they could, roots, wild vegetables, and finally, their own leather belts and shoe soles, boiled for hours to make them pliable enough to swallow. Deng Yingchao almost died here. She contracted a virulent strain of malaria, becoming delirious and falling into a coma for days. It was during this phase that her husband, Zhou Enlai, also nearly died. He contracted amoebic dysentery, which led to a liver abscess. He was burning up with a 104-degree fever and fell into a coma. Deng, herself skeletal and sick, dragged herself off her stretcher to help care for him. She used wet cloths to wipe him down, trying to break the fever. This was their relationship in microcosm. Not romance, but a deep, unbreakable, codependent survival pact. They were two survivors, clinging to each other at the edge of extinction. For 1 solid year, she witnessed tens of thousands die. Of the 86,000 people who left Jiangxi, only around 7,000 made it to the new remote base in Yan'an. Deng Yingchao was one of them. When she arrived in Yan'an in late 1935, she was little more than a skeleton. The tuberculosis had permanently scarred her lungs. She would never be fully healthy again. This was her physical decline, but politically, she had been reborn. Her survival of the Long March was the ultimate peak. It was not an achievement, it was a canonization. The 30 women who started the march, nearly all of them survived, but only by enduring the unimaginable. Deng Yingchao was now more than just an organizer or Zhou Enlai's wife. She was a living legend. She was a veteran of the CCP's founding myth. Her prestige, bought with blood and suffering, was unassailable. In Yan'an, their new cave stronghold in the dry yellow earth, she immediately went back to work. There was no rest. Along with the other survivors, she began organizing women and children, setting up schools in caves, leading weaving cooperatives to make new clothes, and helping to build the basic structures of a new society from the ruins. Politically, she and Zhou Enlai had made a critical choice. During the Long March at the Zunyi Conference, Mao Zedong had seized control of the party from the Soviet-backed leaders. Deng and Zhou, seeing the catastrophic failure of the old line, had decisively thrown their support behind Mao. This loyalty would ensure their political survival for decades to come. 10 years, from 1927 to 1937, had transformed her. She had entered the period a 23-year-old urban organizer, having just lost her last child. She emerged from it at 33, a legendary permanently disabled veteran, barren, but one of the most respected figures in the leadership of a movement that was about to change the world. She had survived the White Terror and the Long March, but a bigger war, one against a brutal foreign enemy, was about to arrive. The survivors in Yan'an had barely caught their breath before a new, more terrifying threat loomed on the horizon. The internal civil war was about to be eclipsed. The Empire of Japan, which had already seized Manchuria, was now preparing for a full-scale conquest. On July 7, 1937, at the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing, a minor skirmish between Japanese and Chinese troops escalated into an all-out invasion. Japan launched a brutal, systematic war to conquer all of China. In that instant, everything changed. The war against Japan was an indescribable catastrophe for China. Cities were bombed to rubble. Millions of civilians were slaughtered. Famine spread. And in the opening weeks of the war, one of the most brutal war crimes in human history occurred: the Nanking Massacre. For 6 weeks, Japanese troops murdered up to 300,000 civilians and unarmed soldiers and assaulted tens of thousands of women. China was on the brink of annihilation. And in this moment of total desperation, the unbelievable happened. Mao's CCP and Chiang's KMT, the mortal enemies who had been slaughtering each other for a decade, were forced into an alliance. This was the Second United Front against Japan. Deng Yingchao, who had survived the KMT's White Terror, now had to sit at the table with the very people who had tried to execute her and her husband. It was an external conflict, but the internal suspicion was immense. They had no choice. Zhou Enlai became the CCP's chief diplomat, moving between Yan'an and the KMT's wartime capital of Chongqing, trying to hold the fragile alliance together. And Deng Yingchao played her own crucial role in this new united front. Her role was not as a high-level negotiator. It was as an organizer, the social bedrock of the Yan'an base. In the cave communes, Deng went back to the work she had always excelled at: organizing women for the anti-Japanese resistance. Thousands of refugees, mostly women and children, poured into the communist-held territory, traumatized and destitute. Deng's job was to turn them from victims into active participants. She created local women's associations. She launched new literacy campaigns. She organized them into women's salvation associations, where they sewed uniforms, bandaged wounded soldiers, and cared for children. She established medical teams to go to remote villages, teaching basic hygiene, family planning, and child health care, a quiet continuation of her mother's medical legacy. She skillfully used her old KMT networks from the May 4th movement. She reached out to former classmates and contacts who were now on the nationalist side, appealing to their patriotism, not their politics, to build bridges and support the common war effort. This was her vital contribution. She was the social glue of the communist rear guard, building a resilient, supportive society behind the front lines, and her stature was growing. As the war against Japan finally neared its end, Deng Yingchao was given a public, symbolic role that highlighted her rising status. In August 1945, just after Japan's surrender, a historic meeting was held in Chongqing. This was the Chongqing Political Consultative Conference. It was a summit between Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong, a last-ditch effort to negotiate a peace and form a coalition government. Deng Yingchao was the only female delegate from the Chinese Communist Party. This was an undeniable peak. For a woman and a communist of her stature to sit as an equal with the most powerful men in China, many of whom had considered her a terrorist just years before, was a powerful statement. She was no longer just an organizer. She was a stateswoman, a living symbol of women's liberation and resilience. But the hope for peace was short-lived. The Civil War resumed in 1946, but this time the tide had turned. Chiang's KMT, despite massive aid from the United States, was rotted through with corruption and had lost the support of the people. Mao's Red Army, now renamed the People's Liberation Army, was disciplined and had the backing of millions of peasants, to whom they promised land reform. Deng Yingchao, as acting secretary of the CCP Women's Committee, played a crucial role in this final victory. She helped mobilize rural women who became the logistical backbone of the PLA. They supplied food, spied on KMT troops, and their support was essential to the communist victory. As the People's Liberation Army swept across China, Deng's role expanded internationally. In 1948, she was elected to the Executive Council of the Women's International Democratic Federation. This was a Soviet-led organization, but it connected her to women from France, America, and around the world. It was a significant Western connection, placing her on a global stage as a leading voice for communism and feminism. As total victory neared in 1949, she was entrusted with one final critical and secret mission. As the KMT forces collapsed and fled to Taiwan, the CCP prepared to form its new government. Deng Yingchao was part of the preparatory committee for the CPPCC, the body that would found the People's Republic of China. It was then that Mao and Zhou gave her a critical and delicate diplomatic mission, a task that only she could perform. The target was Sun Qingling. Sun Qingling was a legend. She was the widow of Sun Yat-sen, the revered father of the nation. She was also the sister of Sun Meiling, Chiang Kai-shek's wife. She had deep American connections, having been educated in the U.S., and was respected internationally. She was a symbol of moral authority. But she was not a communist. Mao and Zhou knew that having Sun Qingling join the PRC government would give their new state priceless legitimacy, both at home and abroad. But she was in reclusion in Shanghai, disgusted with the war. Who could persuade her? Deng Yingchao. As a woman, a respected revolutionary, and a fellow patriot, Deng was the only one who could approach her. She traveled to Shanghai, met with Sun Qingling, and using all her skills of persuasion, invited her to Beijing. She succeeded. Sun Qingling agreed. It was a diplomatic masterpiece, another peak in Deng's career, proving her political influence. On October 1, 1949, Mao Zedong stood on the gate of heavenly peace and declared the founding of the People's Republic of China. Deng Yingchao stood on that rostrum among the new leaders of the nation. 30 years of war, sacrifice, and illness had led to this moment. She was elected vice chairwoman of the All China Women's Federation, a powerful post to continue her life's work. She had achieved her life's goal. She had witnessed the birth of a new nation. But the revolution had been won. And as is so often the case, those who had sacrificed the most, who had fought on the front lines, would soon find themselves pushed to the margins of the new peace. Her personal influence and her place in history was about to face another, longer and quieter decline. On October 1st, 1949, Deng Yingchao, 45 years old, stood on the Tiananmen rostrum. She was surrounded by the victors, Mao, Zhou Enlai, Zhu De, Liu Shaoqi. They were the founding fathers of a nation. Her first act was to help write her life's work into law. In 1950, the new China passed its marriage law. It was a revolutionary document. It banned arranged marriages, polygamy, and the buying of brides. For the first time in Chinese history, it gave women the right to choose their partners, to own property, and, critically, the right to divorce. For Deng, this was the culmination of the May 4th movement. This was the breaking of the feudal chains she had watched bind her own mother. She led a nationwide campaign to publicize the law, sending cadres to the most remote villages to explain to illiterate women that they, for the first time, were free. It should have been her greatest triumph, the beginning of her real work. Her husband, Zhou Enlai, was named premier, the head of the government. He was number 2, the tireless administrator, the diplomatic face of New China, and Deng Yingchao, the veteran revolutionary, the Long March survivor, the nation's leading women's organizer, and the premier's wife, vanished. This disappearance wasn't immediate. It was subtle. It was masked by titles and respect. This was her core personal decline. For the next 27 years, from 1949 until her husband's death in 1976, Deng Yingchao held no government post. Think about that. She was not the Minister of Health despite her family tradition and deep interest in women's health care. She was not the Minister of Education despite starting her career as a teacher. She held no cabinet post at all. She held positions in the party. In 1956, she was elected to the Central Committee, a prestigious post. She remained active in the Women's Federation. But real state power, the day-to-day decision-making power, was kept from her. She was effectively sidelined, placed in an honorary role. Why? Historians debate this. Part of it was, undoubtedly, her health. The Long March had permanently ravaged her lungs. She was often ill, but there were political reasons. Mao and Zhou may have wanted to avoid any appearance of nepotism. Appointing the premier's wife to a high cabinet post would look like a Zhou dynasty. And perhaps there was a simpler, more insidious reason: lingering sexism. For all the revolution's promises of equality, the highest echelons of power remained overwhelmingly male-dominated. Deng Yingchao, who had fought and survived alongside any man, was now reduced to a supporting role. She became, in the public eye, simply Mrs. Zhou, and her cold marriage now became a gilded cage. In the 1920s, it was a political alliance. In the 1930s, a survival pact. Now in the 1950s, it was a public performance. They lived together in Zhongnanhai, the walled leadership compound in Beijing, but they lived separate lives. Zhou Enlai worked relentlessly, often sleeping in his office. Deng lived in her own quarters, managing the household, hosting the wives of other officials, and doing her work at the Federation. They were a power couple with no intimacy, bound by a shared past and political necessity. In 1958, Mao, in a fanatical attempt to surpass Britain and America in industrial output overnight, launched the Great Leap Forward. It was a period of nationwide state-induced mania. Millions of peasants were herded into massive people's communes. All private property was abolished. And to make steel, Mao ordered every village to build backyard furnaces. People threw every piece of metal they owned into these fires: pots, pans, tools, even door handles. The result was millions of tons of useless, brittle pig iron. At the same time, since all the farmers were making steel, no one was harvesting the crops. The result was not a leap forward. It was the Great Chinese Famine. It was, quite simply, the worst famine in human history. Conservative estimates place the death toll at 30 million people. There were widespread documented reports of cannibalism. Zhou Enlai, as premier, was the administrator of this nightmare. He knew the reports were fake. He knew people were starving. But he did not dare challenge Mao. And Deng Yingchao? As head of the Women's Federation, she must have received the desperate reports from the countryside of mothers unable to produce milk, of children dying in their arms. But she remained silent. She, like her husband, had become part of the machine. The moral compromise was complete. The Great Leap Forward was such a disaster that Mao's prestige suffered. He was sidelined by more moderate leaders like Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping. Mao did not take this well. In 1966, to reclaim absolute power and purge all his perceived enemies, Mao unleashed the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. It was a decade of state-sanctioned madness. Mao called on the nation's youth, the Red Guards, to bombard the headquarters and destroy the Four Olds. It was a purge of his own party. The Red Guards, millions of fanatical teenagers, closed the schools, dragged their teachers into the streets, and beat them. They ransacked homes, destroying anything old or Western, and they hunted the party leadership. The ultimate target of the Gang of Four, led by Mao's wife Jiang Qing, was Zhou Enlai. He represented everything they hated, the educated, moderate, pragmatic establishment. For Deng Yingchao, this was the beginning of a 10-year nightmare. She was no longer the respected Mrs. Zhou. She was the wife of a potential capitalist roader. The Women's Federation, her life's work, was smashed, branded as bourgeois. She and Zhou survived for one reason. Zhou was indispensable to Mao. Mao needed him to keep the basic functions of the state running. So Zhou engaged in a precarious balancing act, publicly endorsing the Cultural Revolution 100%, while privately trying to mitigate some of the damage and protect a few individuals. He sacrificed old friends and colleagues, signing their arrest warrants to save himself and maintain his position. He and Deng were prisoners in their own government, surrounded by Jiang Qing's fanatics. And it was in this nightmare that the final and most devastating personal tragedy of Deng Yingchao's life occurred. They had no children. It was the great sorrow of their lives. Instead, they had adopted several revolutionary orphans, the children of martyred comrades. Their most beloved, the true daughter of their hearts, was Sun Weishi. She was the daughter of Zhou Enlai's close friend, executed by the KMT in 1927. Zhou and Deng had raised her. She was brilliant, beautiful, and fiery, the Red Princess of the party. She became China's first female director, studying theater in Moscow. And Jiang Qing, Mao's wife, despised her. She hated her for her beauty, her talent, and her closeness to Mao. But most of all, she hated her because she was the daughter of Zhou Enlai, Jiang Qing's greatest political rival. In 1968, at the height of the madness, Jiang Qing made her move. She branded Sun Weishi a Soviet spy. The Red Guards, acting on Jiang Qing's orders, moved to arrest her. But there was a rule. To arrest a family member of a top leader, they needed that leader's signature. The military presented the arrest warrant for Sun Weishi to her adoptive father, Premier Zhou Enlai, and Zhou Enlai signed it. Why? Why would he sign his own daughter's death warrant? Was it a monstrous act of self-preservation, believing that if he refused, he and Deng Yingchao would be next? Or did he naively believe he was protecting her, moving her to a military prison to keep her safe from the Red Guards? We will never know. What we do know is that Deng Yingchao and Zhou Enlai, the premier of China, and his wife, were now powerless. They could not save her. They could not even ask where she was. To do so would be to admit disloyalty and sign their own death warrants. Sun Weishi was taken to a secret prison. There, on Jiang Qing's direct orders, she was systematically tortured for months. On October 14th, 1968, Sun Weishi, 47 years old, died alone in her cell, her body broken. Deng Yingchao and Zhou Enlai were only informed after her death. This was her life tragedy in its final, most horrific form. A cold marriage, childlessness, and now, the one child she had loved as her own, murdered by the very system she had helped create, and with her own husband's signature. The silence in their home in Zhongnanhai must have been unbearable. The years from 1968 to 1976 were a period of profound grief, fear, and political paralysis. Zhou was diagnosed with bladder cancer. He and Deng were broken survivors, trapped, waiting for the end. On January 8, 1976, Zhou Enlai died. His death unleashed a tidal wave of national grief, which was also a silent protest against the Gang of Four. Deng Yingchao, now 72, was a widow. She had lost her husband. She had lost her daughter. Her political protector was gone. She was utterly alone and vulnerable, surrounded by her enemies. From 1949 to 1976, she had gone from triumphant revolutionary to a sidelined figure, a morally compromised survivor, a grieving mother, and finally, a lonely widow. It was the absolute lowest point, the decline of her life. It seemed her story was over, a tragic postscript to a revolutionary life. But 1976 wasn't finished. In September, Mao Zedong died. And less than a month later, the Gang of Four was arrested in a midnight coup. The Cultural Revolution was over. And for the 72-year-old widow Deng Yingchao, one final astonishing late peak was about to begin. 1976 was the year the political tide finally turned. Zhou's death, Mao's death, and the arrest of the Gang of Four created a vacuum. For Deng Yingchao, 72 years old, everything changed. She was no longer just a widow. She was a living symbol. She was one of the very few first-generation revolutionary leaders who had survived both the Long March and the Cultural Revolution with her reputation intact. She was the embodiment of suffering and endurance, and most importantly, she was the widow of Zhou Enlai, the man who was now being venerated as a national saint, a symbol of the pragmatic decency the Cultural Revolution had destroyed. To honor Deng Yingchao was to honor Zhou Enlai, and to bring her into power was the most definitive way to reject the legacy of Mao and Jiang Qing. This was not a time for retirement. This was a time for resurrection. Her late peak began immediately. In December 1976, just 2 months after the Gang of Four's arrest, Deng Yingchao was appointed vice chairwoman of the Standing Committee of the National People's Congress. This was a major state post, placing her back in the center of legislative power, a place she had never been allowed to occupy while her husband was alive. But this was only the beginning. By 1978, a new paramount leader had emerged, Deng Xiaoping, the twice-purged reformer. He was about to launch his reform and opening up policy, a second revolution, and he needed allies with unassailable moral authority. He turned to Deng Yingchao, and in December 1978, she was given 3 extraordinary, powerful roles. First, she was elected to the 24-member Politburo. This was the inner sanctum, the highest decision-making body in the party. She had finally reached the highest level of party leadership, a position rarely held by women. Second, she was named second secretary of the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection. This role was critical. The CCDI was the party's internal watchdog, its police force, its high court. Its first job? To clean up the mess of the Cultural Revolution. Think of the profound, bitter irony. Deng Yingchao, the woman who had lived in powerless silence while her adopted daughter was tortured to death, was now in charge of hunting down and punishing the very types of people who had committed that crime. She had gone from victim of the purges to overseeing the process of justice and rehabilitation for others. And third, she was made head of the Central Leading Group for Taiwan Affairs. This was one of the most sensitive files in the government. Deng Xiaoping wanted a new, peaceful approach to reunification. And who better to be the face of this new policy? Not a stone-faced general, but Sister Deng, the respected widow of Zhou Enlai, a national matriarch. Suddenly, Deng Yingchao, at 74, was one of the most powerful women in the world. She was a top legislator, an internal high judge, and the chief diplomat on the Taiwan issue. For the next decade, she embraced these roles. As head of the CCDI, she oversaw the rehabilitation of millions of party members unjustly purged during the Cultural Revolution. As the head of Taiwan affairs, she became the voice of reconciliation, using the United Front skills she had honed in the 1930s. She also became a global diplomat named Honorary President of the Chinese People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries, strengthening ties with the West. And then, in 1983, she reached her absolute final peak. She was named chairwoman of the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. This was her highest role. She succeeded Deng Xiaoping himself in this position. It was one of the top 4 state leadership posts. The poor girl from Nanning, the 15-year-old student protester, the sick survivor of the Long March, the silent wife of 27 years, was now, at 79, a paramount leader of China, entirely on her own terms. But this new power also revealed her contradictions. She was an economic reformer but a political hardliner. In the 1980s, the internal conflict was between economic reform and political reform. In 1987, when student protests for democracy erupted, the reformer Hu Yaobang was blamed for being too soft. He was forced to resign, and Deng Yingchao, in a clear political move, publicly released a speech from 25 years prior, attacking bourgeois liberalism. The message was clear. Sister Deng was no soft liberal. She supported Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms, but she would tolerate no threat to the Communist Party's absolute power. She had chosen order over liberty. In 1988, having completed her 5-year term as CPPCC chairwoman, she resigned from all her remaining posts. She was 84 years old. Her late peak was over. She retired as a respected elder stateswoman, a living legend. She believed her life's work was done. But history had one last brutal test for her and for her generation. A final storm was gathering. When Deng Yingchao retired in 1988, she was 84 years old. She was one of the last of the elders, a living revolutionary icon. She had survived the fall of a dynasty, warlords, a foreign invasion, a civil war, a famine, and a psychotic purge. She had earned her rest. But the 20th century had one final tragic test for her. In the spring of 1989, the death of Hu Yaobang, the reformer she had helped to oust, sparked something extraordinary. Thousands of university students flooded into Tiananmen Square in Beijing to mourn him. But the mourning quickly turned into a massive pro-democracy protest. They were a new generation, the children of the reform and opening up. And they were demanding an end to corruption, freedom of the press, and democracy. For weeks, the square became a city of hope, and the historical parallel was impossible to ignore. This was the May 4th movement reborn. This was exactly what Deng Yingchao, as a 15-year-old girl, had done on the streets of Tianjin 70 years earlier. She had marched. She had demanded democracy. She had defied a corrupt government. Now, her grandchildren's generation was doing the same. But the 85-year-old Deng Yingchao was no longer the 15-year-old idealist. She was a party elder, a hardliner. And when she looked at Tiananmen Square, she did not see idealism. She saw chaos. Her entire 85-year life had been a war against chaos. The chaos of the warlords, the chaos of the Japanese invasion, and most terrifyingly, the chaos of the Cultural Revolution, when Mao had unleashed the youth and they had nearly destroyed the party and the nation. To her, the students in the square were not patriots. They were new Red Guards. They were the seeds of a second cultural revolution, a chaos that would undo everything she had spent her life building. In the power struggle raging within the party, Deng Yingchao stood firmly with the hardliners, with Deng Xiaoping and with the premier, Li Ping. Li Ping, notably, was her other adopted son. the revolutionary orphan she and Zhou had raised. When Deng Xiaoping made the decision that there could be no compromise, that stability was paramount, and that the movement must be crushed, Deng Yingchao aligned firmly with the party hardliners, who ordered the Tiananmen suppression. She, who had begun her career as a student activist demanding democracy, ended it by endorsing the use of military force against student activists. It is the final tragic contradiction of her life. She chose order over liberty, party discipline over the ideals of her youth. After the massacre, Deng Yingchao's health, already fragile, began to decline rapidly. Her legacy was now sealed. Her body, ravaged by tuberculosis 60 years prior, finally began to give out. In 1990, she was hospitalized 5 times, resigning from her remaining honorary posts. She was fighting for her life. In 1992, she fell into a coma from kidney failure. She lay unconscious for weeks, and according to an anecdote later recounted by a journalist, in that delirium she murmured one name, a final, little-known event. She did not call for her husband, Zhou Enlai. She did not call for her mother. She did not call for Sun Weishi, her murdered daughter. Her last reported, though unverified, word was Li Ping, the name of her adopted son, the name of the premier who had overseen the Tiananmen crackdown. A final cryptic whisper, a mother's call for her son, a final affirmation of her hardline political choice. We will never know. On July 11, 1992, Deng Yingchao died in a Beijing hospital. She was 88 years old. As she had wished, there was no state funeral, no mausoleum. Her ashes were scattered with her husband's from a plane over the rivers and lands of China. A final symbolic invisible reunion with her comrade of 51 years. A final symbolic invisible reunion with her comrade of 51 years. Her story begins and ends with silence. It was the silence of a woman navigating a world of loud, violent men. It was the silence of endurance, the only defense available when her body failed. Her children were lost, and her political ideals were betrayed by the very party she built. This silence was her armor, the psychological shield she forged in childhood. But in the end, that same armor became her cage, locking her inside the public role of Mrs. Zhou and consigning her true independent self to the shadows of history. In many ways, Deng Yingchao's life is the balance sheet of the 20th century revolution. It represents the promise, a poor fatherless girl rising to become a national leader, breaking millennia of feudal oppression. But it also represents the terrifying inhuman cost. Her story forces us to weigh the liberation of a nation against the price of a single human soul. It asks if a revolution born from a cry for freedom can ever succeed if it demands total moral compromise, the sacrifice of one's own family, and the final tragic betrayal of its own founding ideals. The ghost of the Chinese Revolution, then, is not Mao or Zhou. It is the contradiction that Deng Yingchao embodies. So who was she, truly? Was she the 15-year-old idealist on the streets of Tianjin, screaming for Mr. Democracy? Or was she the 85-year-old elder, endorsing the tanks that crushed those same ideals? Perhaps the final tragedy is that after a lifetime of survival, there was no difference. Perhaps the revolution she served demanded nothing less than her entire self, consuming the woman, Deng Wenshu, and leaving only the icon, Sister Deng, a silent survivor.